About 3 hours into Doom Revelations, my opinion completely changed. I realized I barely used my shield, and that shouldn't have been possible, because the Dark Ages wasn't just built around the shield, it was defined by it. Instead, I found myself using the Chain Spear almost exclusively. Not because the shield suddenly became bad, but because Revelations quietly transforms the Dark Ages into something that feels surprisingly close to Doom Eternal. And somehow, it works. When Doom the Dark Ages launched, it divided the fanbase more than any modern Doom game. Some players loved its slower, shield-focused combat. Others couldn't stop comparing it to Doom Eternal. And honestly, I understand both sides. The Dark Ages wasn't trying to be eternal. It wanted you to stand your ground, control the arena, and let the demons come to you, instead of constantly flying around the battlefield. So when Revelations was announced, I expected more of that philosophy. What I got instead was something much more interesting. Without spoiling anything, Revelations wastes very little time getting started. After the opening mission, the Slayer is thrown into Purgatory, an entirely new setting for the franchise, where almost all of your equipment is stripped away. What does the game give you instead? The Chain Spear. It's a smart introduction because it forces you to learn the DLC's biggest new mechanic instead of falling back on everything you already mastered. Rather than telling a brand new story, Revelations bridges the Dark Ages with Doom 2016. It answers a few long-standing questions without ever slowing the action down. It's simple, but that's never really been the point. Like most Doom games, the gameplay is a real star of the show, and Revelations might have the most interesting evolutions in combat that I've seen from this series in years. I'll be honest, my first hour with the Chain Spear wasn't great. Before I could even start learning it, I immediately ran into a bug where the tutorial didn't display any controller prompts. Instead of showing the correct button input, it simply displayed 2 question marks. After several minutes of trying to figure out what was wrong, I eventually reset my controls back to default, and that mostly fixed the issue. Thankfully, the bug was patched a few days later, but even after that, I still wasn't sold. The default controls felt awkward, and I spent the next hour experimenting with different button layouts, just trying to figure out something that felt natural. Even after remapping everything, the Chain Spear still felt like a huge departure from the base game. The slashes felt awkward, and the parry timing never quite clicked. And after spending dozens of hours mastering the shield, I honestly thought I was going to spend the rest of the DLC wishing I had it back. I couldn't have been more wrong. And then, somewhere around the middle of the campaign, everything clicked. Once I finally understood how the Chain Spear worked alongside the dash, combat completely opened up. Instead of waiting for enemies to come to me, I was creating my own openings. Every encounter became this constant rhythm of dashing between enemies, pulling myself into combat, chaining together parries, and immediately moving to the next target. It was faster, more aggressive, but somehow it still felt like the Dark Ages. Before I even realized it, I wasn't reaching for the shield anymore. In fact, I think I only used it once after getting it back. Not because the shield suddenly became bad, but because the Chain Spear had become that much fun. And that's when I realized something. Revelations wasn't trying to replace the Dark Ages. It was trying to bridge the gap between the Dark Ages and Doom Eternal. The entire time I was playing, I kept asking myself one question. Is this just Doom Eternal again? Early on, I genuinely thought the answer was yes. The Chain Spear reminded me so much of Eternal's meat hook that I assumed id Software had simply gone back to what players already knew. And honestly, part of me was a little disappointed. One of my favorite things about the Dark Ages was that it wasn't trying to be eternal. It had its own identity, and I wanted to see that philosophy pushed even further. But the more I played, the more I realized I was looking at Revelations the wrong way. Yes, the Chain Spear adds a lot more mobility, but the combat never fully becomes Doom Eternal. The arenas still encourage you to stand your ground. You're still controlling the pace of each fight instead of frantically sprinting laps around the arena. The combat still has that heavier, more methodical feel that made the Dark Ages stand out. It borrows some of Eternal's best ideas without sacrificing what made the Dark Ages feel different in the first place. One of my favorite improvements had nothing to do with combat. It's the way Revelations handles exploration. Unlike the base game, the DLC no longer reveals every secret on the map from the very beginning. Instead, you have to earn those secrets. I found myself checking side paths, looking behind destructible walls, and paying much closer attention to the environment instead of simply following map markers. What I appreciated even more were the areas you couldn't access the first time through. Throughout the campaign, you'll come across blocked off paths, locked doors, and hidden rooms that require abilities you haven't unlocked yet. Once you recover the shield, and especially once you obtain the master key in the endgame, the game opens up in a really satisfying way. Suddenly, revisiting earlier missions isn't just about grabbing a missed collectible. It's about discovering areas that simply weren't available during your first playthrough. I wouldn't call Revelations a Metroidvania, but it definitely borrows some of the progression philosophy, and I think the DLC is better because of it. It gives exploration a real sense of progression instead of turning it into a checklist. Another thing Revelations absolutely nails is its level design. There may only be a handful of missions, but don't let that fool you. Every single level felt massive. Most of my first playthrough took well over an hour each. And okay, maybe part of it is because I'm not exactly a speedrunner, but even then, these levels are packed with combat encounters. Compared to the base game, it felt like every mission asked more from the player before finally giving you a chance to breathe. It felt like every time I thought I was reaching the end of an arena, the game threw another wave of demons at me. Thankfully, the enemy variety keeps those encounters from being repetitive. Almost every fight introduces a new combination of enemies that forces you to adapt instead of relying on the same strategy over and over again. Although, I definitely developed a few personal enemies along the way. First and foremost, the Archvile. I already hated those things in the previous Doom games, and somehow, they're even worse here. I honestly think this is the strongest version of the Archvile we've seen. And don't even get me started on those purple pain elementals. The second one spawned in, it immediately became my number one target. Ignore it for a few seconds, and the fight can spiral out of control really quickly. Between the longer missions, the variety of encounters, and some genuinely memorable boss fights, Revelations never gave me a chance to settle into a routine. Every level introduced a new challenge, and I think that's a huge reason the combat stayed engaging from beginning to end. Doom Revelations surprised me. Going into this DLC, I expected one of two things. Either id Software would double down on the slower, shield-focused combat that made the Dark Ages feel so different, or they'd completely return to the high-speed gameplay of Doom Eternal. Instead, they found a balance. The Chain Spear adds just enough mobility to make combat feel fresh, while the arenas, pacing, and encounter design still encourage the more grounded style that made the Dark Ages stand out. By the end of the campaign, the shield had become secondary to the Chain Spear, not because it suddenly became a bad mechanic, but because the Chain Spear was simply that much fun to use. Beyond the campaign itself, Revelations also gives you plenty of reasons to come back. Between the Master Key, hidden classic Doom levels, and the optional true final boss, I found myself wanting to jump right back in after the credits rolled. A small part of me still wishes id Software had pushed the shield-focused philosophy even further. It was one of the boldest ideas the series had introduced in years, but after finishing Revelations, I understand why they didn't. Doom Eternal perfected movement, the Dark Ages reinvented combat. Revelations proves those two ideas were never competing. They were building towards each other. If you made it this far, thank you. I'm trying to build a channel that's less about chasing launch day hype and more about having a thoughtful conversation after the dust settles. If that sounds like your kind of content, I'd really appreciate you subscribing. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.